And welcome back to another Cannabis Thought Leadership podcast. This is Abe Cohn with THC Legal Group, and today I'm with Emily from Flourish Farms. Emily, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show, Abe.
Great, yeah, thank you so much. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where do you work? How are you involved in the industry? What interests you about the industry? Tell us a little bit so we can get to know you a little bit better.
Sure. So I'm one of the founding board members of Flourish Farms, and we're a research group focused on contributing to a natural and sustainable future for the cannabis industry. So our founding team is made up of scientists, PhDs, other academics who decided to take their research interests to the private market.
Okay.
And so we have several research projects currently underway. My personal focus is on cannabis education and particularly helping patients find the right cannabis products for them. So my background is in the philosophy of science, and specifically I looked at scientific methodologies used to gather data on subjective states. So when scientists are researching medications and they want to know, for instance, whether something reduces pain, they need to find out subjective facts from the people they're researching about how they're feeling. And so I looked into different methods of gathering that data in objective ways.
Wow. There's something, I can't quite remember where I read this, but I think it was from the philosopher, maybe Daniel Dennett, and he has this famous article that he wrote called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And essentially the idea behind the article is to point out how subjective these experiences are, and I think the term he uses is something called qualia. So each person has these essential internal experiences, and even at the highest level when we speak about them, it's just so difficult and ultimately futile to think that we'll ever be able to capture exactly what that experience is as that person is experiencing it. So how do you go about bridging that gap between you and the patient that you're speaking to?
Yeah, so really what's important is finding ways to communicate back and forth between the patient and the researcher so that all of the information that's being gathered is really accurate to the patient's experience. And so there are a lot of different ways that you can construct survey data where you're asking really specific questions so that you can get the specific information that you want. In terms of the cannabis research, what I've done is taken the same type of tools and methodologies for being able to gather that data and created tools for patients to use those on their individual case. So one of the big problems for patients is that once they get a recommendation for cannabis from their doctor, oftentimes they're still left with a lot of questions about what type of cannabis to use, what strains of cannabis might be helpful for them, what way to intake the cannabis, whether they should smoke it, whether they should use it edibly. And the way that these different types of cannabis affects people can also vary from person to person. I got into using cannabis as a patient. I have multiple chronic pain and fatigue conditions. And so when I started using cannabis, I found that some varieties really, really helped. I would go from being in so much pain that I was really unable to get anything done all day to just being back to my full self, able to think very clearly, get work done on my dissertation, interact with the people that I cared about. And with other varieties of cannabis, I was finding that my mind was really cloudy. I couldn't think clearly. Sometimes the pain that I was dealing with was emphasized. Sometimes I was getting too sleepy to function from the strains that I was picking. And so at that time, I started using my research background to create tools to hone in on what products were going to actually work for my needs. when I was able to do that, I went from looking into signing up for disability because I was sick and having to take off time from work so much, to just being back to being fully functioning. I decided at that point that I wanted to switch my focus, my career focus, into cannabis and work full time on helping other patients, find this kind of benefit from the plant.
What's interesting
so
about
that,
yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, we've had a lot of different people on the podcast, and different people in the community really feel passionate about different aspects of it. So what I'm getting from you is kind of this push to focus on the medicinal benefits of it, and for many patients, the medicinal necessities of it. I'm just curious about kind of what your thoughts are on government regulation, given the need to ensure that this medicine does in fact do what it's supposed to do and isn't tainted by other sorts of contaminants. Are you in favor of a tighter government grip on it to ensure that it is in fact healthy, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I do think that regulated testing is very important to the cannabis market for patients' health. There's definitely been a lot of cases of contamination, particularly mold and pesticide contamination, but then also dealing with chemical solvents and things like that can get into the medicine that patients are using. It's often not much of a problem for a healthy smoker who's maybe using it for recreational means. But when you have patients with compromised immune systems, if they, inhale some of the wrong type of mold, that could be a fatal situation. And so I'm very much in favor of having testing be regulated. I think that there needs to be some openness in the system of regulation to allow for a wide variety of different types of cannabis options. Uh-huh. And what we're seeing in a lot of the newer states that are opening up is that they're having very strict regulations on what type of cannabis. And that varies from state to state, but some have restrictions on what strains are available, what genetic varieties. Others have restrictions on, whether you can use concentrates or edibles, whether you can smoke the flower. And I think it's really important to leave all of the different instantiations of cannabis available to patients, because there's such a wide variety of needs amongst patients, and some strains just will not help a patient with the need that they are looking for, while others will be incredibly helpful. So as we're regulating, I think it's very important to consider policies that encourage a wide variety of options.
So, and one of the things you mentioned, which many people are kind of extraordinarily offended by on the state level, is that these medical programs coming out of different states do not allow for smoking of the cannabis. They only allow ingestion in other forms. Is it fair to say that, of course I understand, as you said earlier, cannabis differently, but would it be reasonably accurate to suggest that people do not gain as much of a health benefit from smoking the cannabis as they would from ingesting it through an edible or perhaps a different tincture and oil? What do you think about that?
I would say that it's actually not fair to say that patients get less medicinal benefit from smoking.
Okay.
There's actually been a fair bit of research on the harms of smoking cannabis, and it hasn't really come up with very much. There's sort of this idea that smoking anything could cause cancer. There have been long longitudinal studies looking at heavy chronic cannabis smokers that found that it actually can help decrease the risk of cancer. If you are smoking cannabis and tobacco concurrently, it lowers your chance of getting cancer from the tobacco. So there are sort of misconceptions about the negative effects of smoking cannabis. In terms of the positive effects, there are very particular phenomenological effects that go along with smoking that are not the same as what you would get from other types of ingestion. So nausea is a good example. That's one of the things that I use cannabis for. I have chronic nausea every day. And this also comes up a lot for, obviously, chemo patients that are suffering from nausea and using cannabis for palliative means. For some reason, smoking in a joint form tends to relieve nausea much more effectively than other methods. Now, with edibles, this makes a lot of sense because usually you need to respond to nausea immediately. And by the time that you eat something, it gets to your stomach to be able to give you that relief. It's really not dealing with whatever was in your stomach causing you to be upset at that time. With a joint, you can get that relief very effectively and immediately. And patients just tend to report that method relieves their nausea much more effectively.
And what about
I've also
I was just going to say, as we further distill down into what works better than other methods, how about smoking a bong versus smoking a joint?
Yeah, so that will also create a different kind of phenomenological effect. So people report with bongs a lot of time, they get much more cerebral effects. And so patients sometimes will use that if they're looking for some kind of mind-altering effects from their cannabis. So this can come up, for example, with patients who are using it for PTSD. And so you might be stuck in a sort of mental space that you want to be able to jolt yourself out of. And so having more of the cerebral effects, looking for genetics that give more of a hazy mental effect, can be really helpful in those situations. And so it really varies from person to person what kind of effect you're looking for, what type of method or genetics will be more medicinal for you.
Well, in your experience and research, are there any people who you think would decidedly not benefit from it and perhaps be adversely affected from using cannabis?
I think that there are areas where I think there are certainly people who do not benefit from cannabis, that have tried cannabis and it doesn't work for them in one way or another. I think sometimes in that case, it's because they haven't tried the right type of cannabis. But there are certain medical conditions that are counterindicated for cannabis. If you have an extremely rapid heart rate, cannabis can raise your heart rate, so that could be a dangerous situation. There's research coming out on schizophrenia, which suggests that high THC might have negative implications for schizophrenics, but CBD could be very incredibly helpful. And so I think that cannabis in some forms can certainly be harmful to some people if they have certain predispositions. In general, I think there's usually some type of cannabis that could be helpful for some medical reason for most people because of its broad applicability.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely want to get into talking about CBD. But before we do, one of the more contentious legal decisions surrounding cannabis and the industry is the DEA's classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substance Act. And to be a Schedule I drug, it means that the drug in question has no medicinal value and a huge propensity for abuse. What do you attribute that to? I mean, we've just spent the last 10 minutes talking about how healthy it is and how much good it can do for a person. Why do you think the DEA scheduled it as a Schedule I?
Well, I think if we look back at the historical data, it really seems that the prohibition of cannabis was for political motivations, and unfortunately, very racist motivations. In that it was consumed much more by certain minority groups that the political powers at the time wanted to be able to disempower by arresting them for using this medicine.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the medical research, even at the time of prohibition, the medical experts of the time were saying, no, this has broad medical use, and in fact, has been used as medicine for thousands of years. Cannabis was in the majority of the medical compounds, available at the time that it was prohibited. And so, why is it continued? Why is the prohibition continued? I think part of it is misinformation, that there are a lot of people who believe that there are incredibly harmful effects from cannabis that are just not familiar with the actual medical research. And I think there are unfortunately financial reasons to keep cannabis in that prohibition state. There's a lot of money tied up in cannabis prohibition.
Well, and how do you feel about CBD and its medicinal benefits as it is consumed distinct from using marijuana with the THC component too? Do you think CBD is as good by itself, or people talk about this entourage effect where kind of the totality of the plant without separating any of its parts out from one another is really what produces the maximum health benefits? How do you view CBD as a standalone product?
Yeah, I think that the research on CBD does show that there are a fair bit of medical properties for CBD by itself. And so it can be very helpful. And for patients that are in states that only allow for CBD, I think it's always worth trying out if it's for one of the medical uses that's been explored. I think that in most cases, you're going to have a more effective medicine if it's CBD in combination with other cannabinoids and terpenes. But that, again, really depends on the use for it. And so, like we were talking about, for schizophrenic patients, CBD might be the ideal medicine. And mixing it with the other cannabinoids and terpenes might introduce effects that you're not looking for. For the majority of patients, they're usually looking for pain relief, mood elevation, basic things like that. You're usually going to get more effective results from something that has a combination of cannabinoids.
That's very interesting. There are so many interesting features of this discussion, particularly the one we're having, of course, but then the broader implications of focusing on cannabis as a medicine and how that fits into public policy making. Are you involved at all in working with different policy groups and advocates and people involved in the political scene to try to get it fully legal? What is your experience dealing with the government?
Yeah, so at Flourish, we've really been working closely with the local government in Sonoma as we're going through this switch over to the new regulations in California. Each locality is having to figure out how they want to handle the new laws, what they want to allow in their area. And so we've been very politically involved in that process, talking to city officials, bringing people out to our land to see our operation. And we've been very active in pushing for environmentally sound growing practices. One of our other projects, actually a research project led by my husband, Dr. Josh Earlenbaugh, is focused on creating environmental sustainable solutions for indoor growing. So one of the big issues for indoor growing is energy consumption as well as water use are incredibly high. And so in a lot of areas, you're finding the grid is just too taxed to be able to have these huge indoor grows. So we've actually developed this technique to bring the sunlight into the indoor environment, which has drastically cut electricity costs by 80 to 90%.
Really? Is this a proprietary technique that you've developed?
It is, yes.
Wow.
So we are distributing the technology that brings the light into the indoor space, as well as consulting on how to effectively grow with the technology.
Well, I hope you've developed gotten a good patent for it, Emily.
We definitely have our lawyers on that.
It's so interesting. Are you seeing a lot of technology kind of developing as a function of the new research that's coming out? People talk about the cannabis industry as being a green rush, but beyond selling the herb, there are all of these auxiliary businesses, quite literally sprouting up to keep up with this new industry. How are you experiencing that? Do you see a lot of interesting things arising, new entrepreneurship up and coming?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a lot of startups in the space right now, and a lot of new innovation coming to answer all of the demands of this new, now regulated industry. Mm-hmm. So it's been interesting to see both the new people coming into the industry that are trying to bring their talent sets from other industry in, as well as the people who have sort of been here already working in the cannabis industry, having to adjust their business models to the new regulations and try to make that transition. So it's really a very vital time for people to get involved, in that there's lots of opportunity and there's lots of things up in the air. But it's also a very, very competitive time because there's so many people who are seeing that opportunity and coming in looking to get involved.
Right. Well, listen, we're coming towards the end of the conversation. What does it mean to you to be a part of this industry? What do you want people to know about your role in the industry? How should people kind of start thinking about it as we move into the new year?
Yeah, I guess for me, my focus in the industry is really looking forward to the future of the industry, and working to create a sustainable future for that industry. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that goes from, all the way from the growing of the cannabis, the production of the products, to actually linking the patients up to that product. So my focus is really on helping to guide the cannabis industry into that more sustainable space.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's wonderful. We've had a lot of different interesting things come up during this interview. If people want to get in touch with you, learn more about what you're doing, about the company that you're working with, how do they connect with you?
Sure. So you can look up more about Flourish Farms at flourishfarms.com. We're also on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook under Flourish Farms, all one word. And that's spelled Fleurish.
Wonderful.
So a little bit different than normal spelling of Flourish.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you can follow me on Instagram at Emily Earlenbaugh, and that's EARLENBAUGH.
Wonderful. Well, listen, Emily, thank you so much for coming on. This was certainly a pleasure for me, and I know our audience will get a lot out of this discussion too. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. It was a great conversation.
Great. Okay, well, that is another Cannabis Thought Leaders podcast. We will see you soon.